Welcome back, folks, to another episode of History with Tony, where we are discussing those decadent decades, the mobsters and the desperados of the 20s and 30s. Of course, if you've been with me, you know that we've been carrying it up to more in the 50s and 60s as well. We're trying to kind of make a continuum here so you can have an idea, because these guys that started in the 20s and 30s, uh, they lasted a lot of them until the 50s and 60s, sometimes in the 70s. In the case of Joe Bonanno, clear up in the 90s. So, they were around quite a little while. So let's kind of review what we talked about last week. We began looking at how the mafia began to expand after Prohibition. They realized that if they were going to survive, they needed a new source of revenue. And so they decided they were going to start moving some of their operations to the West, California, Nevada, the South, Florida, and even into Cuba, because that's where a lot of the burgeoning tourist trade was going. And people were looking for a good time. And so the mafia was more than willing to give it to them. Of course, they wanted their share of the business, and that's exactly what they did. They began moving into these markets. They didn't abandon their markets where they were by any means at all. I mean, they continued operating there, but they knew they needed a new source of revenue, which was primarily gambling, in these areas. So we looked at how the first place they tackled was California. Obviously, California was a growing area with the new oil industry out there, water coming to it from the Sierra Nevada mountains, and most importantly, the burgeoning uh, film industry, which was just bringing tons and tons of revenue into Hollywood and Los Angeles. The problem was the guy that was running the mafia outfit out there, and it was really kind of in its infancy, was an old mustache Pete. So they decided they wanted a new guy. And according to the legend, during the night of the Sicilian Vespers, where Luciano had all of his, old mustache Pete's, done away with, uh, they did away with the guy that was in charge of the mafia out there, replaced him with a young Turk by the name of Jack Dragna. Jack Dragna was okay, but he just wasn't very innovative. He just, he was kind of low ambition, you know. And as a result was they decided this guy needs some help. And who better to help him out than Bugsy Siegel? They wanted to kind of get rid of Bugsy anyway because he had been bringing a little bit too much attention over out in New York. And they thought, hey, he'll fit in right in Los Angeles and Hollywood because he loves attention, and they were willing to give it to him out there. So Siegel goes out west to help, develop Los Angeles, the market. Of course, Siegel eventually turns his eyes towards Las Vegas, where his vision did come true, but unfortunately too late for Bugsy because, you know, he he started skimming the skim and stealing money from the mob, and that's a no-no, and they got rid of him. He was replaced in Los Angeles by a man by the name of Mickey Cohen, and he and Dragna then got involved in a serious uh, war between an interwar mafia turmoil, often been called the Battle of Sunset Strip, which raged in the 50s. And I mean, it was a pretty big deal. Eventually, the police got a hold of the whole thing. And under their chief of police by the name of William Parker, uh, he started really putting the pressure on the mafia in Los Angeles. He created this gangster squad, as it's often been called, where they used methods that today would probably put the police in jail. But it was effective. It worked. The mafia never got the stranglehold on Los Angeles that it did in New York and Chicago and some of these other cities. It just, it's out there, and it's an important part of their criminal syndicate out there. But it was never like it was back east. Uh, so, in part due to William Parker. So, I don't know what I did there. Okay, so that's what we did last week. So let's start looking at where we go today. We're going to look at the life of a man who has often been called the most interesting character in the mafia. Got those Cuban rhythms going here. Well, we're going to talk today about Johnny Roselli. Um, you maybe have never heard of Johnny Roselli. You know, in a group of people, the mafia, you've had a lot of interesting, colorful characters. They may have been criminals, but they were colorful. You had Al Capone, you had Lucky Luciano, you had Bugsy Siegel, you had Albert Anastasia, you had John Gotti in the modern era. You know, we've had a lot of interesting characters that have come through the mafia. I don't know that there was anyone more colorful and interesting than Johnny Roselli. His career stretched all the way from the early teen years clear up to 1975. I mean, he was one of the longest serving members of the mafia and one of the most important members of the mafia. And yet, a lot of people never heard of Johnny Roselli. Uh, a lot of people said he's the most interesting mafioso of all time. And indeed, his name became synonymous with the LA Mafia over the 50 years that earned him that title. So let's begin looking at Johnny Roselli and how he got that title. His name Filippo Sacco, born in north of Rome, came to a family with his family in 1911, about 6 years after his birth. Grew up early years in Boston, Massachusetts. And then he fled to New York City and then to Chicago because he got involved in some narcotics trafficking. And, he was trying to escape all this. So he went, to first New York City, then he went to Chicago. It was there that he decided, like a lot of the Italian gangsters, to anglicize his name. And he became Johnny Roselli, you know, and he began to take measures to kind of obscure his immigrant background because he was here illegally. He did not come into the country legally, as a lot of these people didn't back in these days. And so he began to kind of obscure his background so nobody would know exactly who he was or how he got here. That would come back to haunt him in the 60s and 70s because the FBI, once they got involved with him, decided they wanted to get rid of him and they were trying to deport him like they did so many of these gangsters. 2 years later, he moves to the West Coast, again, trying to flee some of the problems he was in. He was still a very young man, just in his early 20s, in the 1920s. Went out west, got involved out in the vice market and the rackets out in LA, and quickly rose through the ranks. He was so suave and so able to communicate. He was one of these guys that would walk into a room and everybody would turn and look at him, and you just liked him. He was one of these charismatic people that seemed to be able to glad hand anybody. He probably would have been a good politician if he had decided to be legal. We won't go anywhere there, okay? I could probably say some things here, but I won't, okay? So anyway, Johnny Roselli becomes very involved with the mob out on the West Coast. And that's a picture of Johnny Roselli in the 30s and 40s. He looked like a typical mobster. Gets out there, and 1927, he decides to go back to Chicago because he wants to go see the Jack Dempsey Gene Tunney boxing match. He goes back to Chicago, and he briefly meets up with Al Capone, and they hit it off. Al was a gregarious type person, so was Johnny Roselli, and they just hit it off. And over the next 3 years, Roselli and Capone began to really kind of communicate, and he kind of became an unofficial associate of the outfit. He was part of the LA Mafia family, but he also was kind of secretly working with Capone's family back in Chicago and making sure that Capone's interest out in the LA area was going okay. He kind of was coordinating with Capone, kind of like a secret agent, you might say. Okay, well, of course, the mafia boss, the old mustache Pete out there, Artizone, was assassinated, replaced by Jack Dragna. And Dragna had already become friends with Roselli. Like I said, everybody wanted to be Roselli's friend because he was just that type of guy. Roselli had developed really close contacts with the LA city government. And the result was that they had a really, really corrupt mayor about this time by the name of Frank Shaw. show you a picture of Frank in a few minutes. And this relationship with the government of LA and the mafia really elevated Roselli in the eyes of the mafia. They thought, hey, this guy's got an inroad with the government. We can use him. And he kind of became the fixer for Jack Dragna. When there was a problem with the government and the mafia, they turned to Johnny and said, hey, can you straighten this out with the mayor? And he said, no problem. I'll take care of it. All the while, he was also working kind of undercover with Capone's mafia family back in Chicago. So you can just see Roselli's rising in power. And then he began to make friends with the movie industry people, particularly the head of Columbia Pictures, man by the name of Harry Cohn. It's supposedly Roselli that manipulated a loan to Cohn from the New Jersey mobster, that was in charge of the family in New Jersey that loaned Harry Cohn some money, which saved his studio. And then he began to make formations and friends with Willie Beoff, who was the head of several theatrical trade unions. So you can see all of a sudden he's got Al Capone in his pocket. He's got the head of the LA Mafia in his pocket. He's got this the mayor of Los Angeles in his pocket, one of the most influential Hollywood producers. Head of a studio is in his pocket. Now he got Willie Beoff, the head of the theatrical unions, in his pocket. I mean, he was really moving up, folks. On top of that, folks, he was a smooth talker. Everybody wanted to be friends with Johnny Roselli. And, he was a bachelor. He never got married, but he had lots of girlfriends. Betty Hutton, Lana Turner, Donna Reed. That shocked me. We all think of Donna Reed. When we think of Donna Reed, she's the all-American mom, from the Donna Reed show back in the 50s. I'm not saying she was bad or anything. I'm just saying, that's the image we have of her. But she was one of Johnny Roselli's ladies at one time or the other. It's even said, the rumor is that he's the one that kind of got Marilyn Monroe, jump-started her career into the movies and got her going. So, you can see, folks, this guy is really making some inroads. So here he is. He's got the LA mayor in his pocket. He's got the head of one of the major studios in his pocket. He's got the labor unions in his pockets, while he's kind of playing, undercover with Al Capone, as well, and the Chicago mob at this time, the outfit, as well as, kind of almost the underboss to Jack Dragna. He's got things going his way, folks. He's really making some moves. Well, between 1943 and 47, he got in a little bit of trouble. Beoff kind of began to overstep his bounds and began to really extort some of the Hollywood moguls out there. And some of them resisted and, went to the police and went to the authorities. And Roselli got caught up in this. And between 1943 and 47, he went to prison for a while. But that didn't hurt him. When he got out, everybody threw him a big party and said, hey, we're so happy you're back and all. But he realized that Las Vegas was where the money was going to be. He had watched Bugsy Siegel and he knew what was coming. And he was able to convince some of the mob family, particularly, the Chicago mob, hey, guys, this is where the money is going to come from. This is, Siegel may have lost his head, but this is the future of the mob and gambling. So he began to shift his, kind of eyes towards Las Vegas. He was kind of going back and forth between Las Vegas and Los Angeles, but he was kind of became the voice of particularly the Chicago mob out in Las Vegas. By that time, they had a new boss, man by the name of Sam Giancana. And Sam Giancana and him were just really close friends. And, he was a square shooter, Roselli was. He was sent out there to make sure that, the mob was getting their fair share of the skin me operations off these major casinos. And by all counts and purposes, he made sure that everything was run right. Of course, he was getting rich over the whole deal. And then as Las Vegas began to grow, one of the big things about Las Vegas was the entertainment industry because they began to have all these shows and all, which brought people to Las Vegas. Well, Roselli was just absolutely, you know, set for that because one of his best friends was Frank Sinatra. And of course, Frank Sinatra brought the Rat Pack with him, as well as a lot of other these entertainers that were really big. And so all of a sudden, Roselli is the one that's kind of basically controlling the entertainment booking industry in Las Vegas. You can see this guy just, I mean, he's got his fingers in everything, but he's kind of under the radar for the public. They don't really know too much about him. Well, by 1960 or so, Roselli had become so powerful that a guy by the name of Ovid Damaris wrote a book called The Greenfelt Jungle, where he kind of exposed Las Vegas as a mafia city. And this is what he writes about Roselli. I thought this says it all better than I could ever say it. He says Roselli is definitely of the new school: sharp silk suits, diamond accessories, swanky apartment, busty showgirls and full leaf minks, big Cadillac, gourmet taste, sportsman golfer, the best of everything and the best of all possible worlds. Roselli spends his leisure hours, that is, all the waking hours of his day, at the Desert Inn Country Club. He has breakfast there in the morning, seated at a table overlooking the 18th green. Between golf rounds, meals, steam baths, shaves, trims, twisting, romancing, drinking, there's time for a little private conferences at his favorite table of people seeking his counsel or friendship. It may be a newsman, it may be a local politician, it may be a casino owner, a prostitute, a famous entertainer, a deputy sheriff, a U.S. senator, the governor of Nevada. In other words, what basically Damaris is saying, this guy knows everybody. He is the man in Las Vegas. And if you want anything done in Las Vegas, you go see Johnny Roselli. Well, of course, Johnny is looking out for himself, but he's also looking out for Sam Giancana, because Sam Giancana is really growing in power in Chicago. He hasn't eclipsed the five families in New York, but he's growing in power a lot. And so he is Sam Giancana's man now. Well, as the 60s bloomed, we all know what happened. You know, Castro comes to power in Cuba and he kicks the mob out. You know, he nationalizes all the casino. He kicks all the mob out. He sends them away, and the mob is not happy because they've lost a whole lot of money and they've lost what they think is their future. And so all of a sudden, you know, you have people like Meyer Lansky and Sam Giancana, Sano Trafficante in Miami, and over in Tampa, that they've decided that they're going to try to get rid of the Cuban dictator. It just so happened that guess who else wants to get rid of the Cuban dictator? The American government, principally the CIA. So in 1960, the CIA went on a look. They wanted to find somebody that would basically get rid of Fidel Castro. And somebody got the ingenious idea, why don't we kind of look at the mafia? So they knew that they could not go directly to the mafia because the mafia wouldn't have anything to do with the CIA. So what they did was they recruited Howard Hughes's fixer, the guy that was, doing all the dirty work for Howard Hughes, man by the name of Robert Mayhew, who happened to be an ex-FBI agent. And the CIA knew him, and he knew that Hughes was basically a straight shooter. They knew that Mayhew had connections. And so they go to Mayhew and they say, hey, is there any way you can hook us up with the mafia to see if we can get them to get rid? We have common interest here. They want to get rid of Castro, so do we. And so Mayhew said, I know just the guy. And he kind of manipulates Roselli into meeting with the CIA. And Roselli goes to work for the CIA. They offered to pay him $150,000. And according to the story, Roselli said, I'm not taking a dime. this is something he said he was a patriot. I know that sounds crazy, but remember, it was Meyer Lansky and Luciano that kept the docks safe during World War II. And so Roselli says, hey, I hate this guy. You don't have to pay me one dime. On top of that, probably, folks, no offense, but $150,000 would be like $150 to me and you. And so anyway, Roselli says, hey, don't worry, we'll take care of this. So he begins to work with Giancana and Trafficani, the story goes. And the mob was supplied with 6 poison pills, and they were supposed to get them to the chef at Castro's thing, and they were supposed to kill him. Well, it never worked out, for one reason or the other. There's all sorts of stories about why it didn't work out. There was a story of exploding cigars and all sorts of other things, but it never happened, as we all know, because Fidel lived not too long ago. So anyway, Roselli, he had begun this working relationship, and then after they couldn't get rid of Castro, the CIA decided they were going to sponsor the invasion of Cuba by all these, disaffected Cuban refugees. And so they come up with the idea of the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And according to the story, guess who was right in the middle of that? Johnny Roselli. He was making connections with the mob and some of these Cuban refugees, and he was kind of getting money and getting arms and things and kind of coordinating things. And so once again, you've got Johnny Roselli right in the middle of trying to get rid of the Bay of Pigs. While all that was going on, there was a problem. Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, who absolutely despised the mafia. And so the brother of the president decides he's going to declare war on the mafia. A lot of people say, what was he thinking? Here the government undercover is working with the mafia, and Kennedy goes after the mafia. Robert Kennedy does. And so anyway, that turned the mob completely off. They said, hey, look, we're not going to have anything to do with this. And on top of that, Roselli is the one that supposedly introduced Marilyn Monroe to Kennedy. And, everybody knows that there was a relationship between John F. Kennedy and maybe Robert Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe. And he also introduced President Kennedy to another woman who became his mistress, a lady by the name of Judith Campbell, who happened to be a mistress to Sam Giancana at the same time. Boy, this gets deep. We could spend hours talking about this. I'm sure millions have already know all about this, but it was really involved. And right in the middle of all this is Johnny Roselli. He's pulling the strings on all this. Well, there are even people that say that Roselli was so upset with Kennedy after the failure of the Castro assassination, and particularly the fiasco of the Bay of Pigs, because the mafia and the Cubans always blamed it on John F. Kennedy's supposed refusal to provide air support, that Roselli was involved with the assassination. Now, there's absolutely no evidence that Roselli had any direct implication in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. There are a lot of stories out there that he was very aware of what was going to happen before it happened. Again, there's no proof, but there's a whole lot of smoke, So you got Robert Mayhew, and you got Fidel Castro, and you got Johnny Roselli, and you've got JFK, and you've got RFK. I mean, it's just like a pot stirring it. I mean, it's ripe for blowing up. Well, right in the middle of all this, Johnny makes another mistake. Okay. He doesn't make a lot of mistakes in his life, but he made another one. He's really interested in becoming kind of like Frank Costello. He wants to shed this image of a gangster and be seen as a good person. And so he convinces his good friend, Frank Sinatra, say, hey, why don't you get me into the Friars Club? Now, I don't know anything about the Friars Club. I just know they have roasts all the time. They're real famous and all. But the Friars Club apparently in California is a really, really big deal. It's kind of like, at the top of the heap as far as, who's who. And so anyway, Frank Sinatra gets Roselli into the Friars Club. But Roselli, being the mafia man, he can't resist trying to make a little money. Well, it so happened there was a lot of gambling going on at the Friars Club. It's a club, and people showed up there every day. People like Zeppo Marx, Phil Silvers, Debbie Reynolds' husband at the time, Harry Carl. They were big time gamblers. Well, it so happened that one of Roselli's associates was fixing card games and cheating. And the story goes that Roselli had his cut from it, and that this was all kind of known to a lot of people. Well, they end up getting caught. Bottom line, and he goes to prison again for 3 years, 1970 to 73. Once he gets out, so we're up to 73 now. He started in the teens. We're up to 1973. He finally gets out and he says, "Hey, I'm retired. I'm going to settle down. I'm going to go to, Miami. I'm done with all this. I don't want to have anything to do with it anymore," which was a bunch of BS. Johnny was a gangster through and through, and he couldn't stand to not be in the limelight. So anyway, he goes to Miami, and guess what happens? One of the senators in the United States government, man by the name of Frank Church, in the mid 1970s, decides he goes on the rampage against the CIA and the FBI and the NSA and all these, and he decides he's going to have a set of hearings which exposes all the secrets, the so-called crown jewels, all these secrets of the FBI and the CIA. And folks, they had a lot of them, okay? And I'm sure they all didn't get exposed. So he ends up finding out, the story's out, Roselli was involved in all this. So Roselli is called to testify before this, the church hearings. Well, Johnny thinks he can handle this. He thinks, hey, no problem, no problem. I can go out here and everything will be just fine. So he testifies a couple of times before the church hearing, really doesn't tell them anything they don't know. But, he kind of, just enough to keep them interested, because he's really not interested in going, he still wants the limelight. And then it became known that Sam Giancana, the old mafia boss of Chicago who has been replaced, was going to get called before the church hearings because they were deep into this thing about the Bay of Pigs and all these plots with the mafia and the CIA and the possible assassination of Kennedy. And so they said, okay, Sam, you're next. And guess what? Sam gets shot and killed in Chicago a couple of nights before he's supposed to testify. Typical mob thing. They say, hey, he's not going anywhere in front of a camera. He knows too much. And so they get rid of Sam. Well, now it's Johnny's turn. Well, he goes before, the hearing. And again, he doesn't reveal a whole lot of stuff, but he reveals just enough to keep them interested. And so by the time they get to where they're investigating the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the potential implication of the CIA and all these other agencies, which again, there's no proof that they were involved, but they were investigating it. And they called Roselli to come back and said, hey, we want you to testify again in front of this. He never got the chance. August 7th, 1975, a fisherman, found a 55-gallon drum floating offshore in Miami, pulled it over to his boat, brought it to the shore, opened it up, and went, whew, I know what that smell is. Called the police. They come out, investigate it, and sure enough, somebody at Deep Six, Johnny, he's gone. He knew too much. He was the man that had all the secrets. I mean, I'm telling you, this guy probably knew more about what had gone on in the 50 years he was in the mafia than maybe anybody else. I mean, he was everywhere. and he had his fingers in every pie of the mafia. And the mafia had finally decided, hey, enough is enough. This guy's got to go away. And so they deep sixed him. And so Handsome Johnny has become, as he had become known, is deep sixth. This is the drum, and this is some of the headlines. Uh, so that's the life of Johnny Roselli. Now, if you're interested in all this, there's a pretty good book about the Los Angeles Mafia called the Los Angeles Mafia. But this book is just fantastic, folks. I've read this book recently. I'm telling you, if you get a chance to go to the library or something and get it, you ought to get it. It is a really good book if you're interested in this stuff. Handsome Johnny, The Life and Death of Johnny Roselli, Gentleman Gangster, Hollywood Producer, CIA Assassin. You know, I mean, it's just a really interesting book about a really interesting man. So that's it for the day. You know, next week we're going to look at what happens in Las Vegas. We know all about Bugsy Siegel, but we're going to look at what happens after that and probably a little bit more because the Las Vegas story is almost as interesting as the Johnny Roselli story because you got guys like Howard Hughes involved, you know, so it gets pretty interesting, you know. So anyway, I'll let you go. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I will see you next week. Bye bye.